This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
U.S. travel ban on Europe begins as many countries step up containment of COVID-19. We focus on Africa and its efforts to stem the spread of COVID-19. And we take a look at some of the women identified by Time magazine as most influential in shaping the past century. This is CGTN. Welcome to Africa Live with me, Beatrice Marshall, in Nairobi. Also ahead this hour, shareholders report continued losses as more countries report new cases of the coronavirus. And coming up in your sports, CAF postpones the March 2021 Africa Cup of Nations qualifiers due to the coronavirus threat. A dramatic increase in the number of new coronavirus cases has been reported worldwide. Outside China, over 63,000 cases have been reported in more than 120 countries. Italy has the largest outbreak outside China, reporting 2,500 new cases on Friday. The country has over 17,000 confirmed cases in total and over 1,000 deaths. 3-digit and 4-digit increases have been reported in some other European nations, including Spain. The country has over 5,000 cases. As the government announced on Friday, it will impose a state of emergency. In Asia, Iran has over 11,000 cases and over 500 deaths. South Korea has over 100 new cases. Its confirmed cases have surpassed 8,000 with 72 deaths. 5 countries in Africa confirmed their first cases of COVID-19 on Friday, giving the disease a foothold in 19 countries on the continent. In China, the city of Wuhan, where the coronavirus originated, reported a record low of 4 new cases on Friday. The country's total number of confirmed cases is around 81,000. Over 80% of them have recovered, while over 12,000 are still receiving treatment. More than 3,000 have died. In Hubei province, cities outside Wuhan have seen no new cases for over a week now, and the province recorded no new suspected cases on Friday. While the United Nations Secretary General has urged world leaders to declare war on the new coronavirus. In a video message to the world, Antonio Guterres said preventing the further spread of the virus was a shared responsibility for all.
The spread of the virus will peak, our economies will recover, and until then we must act together to slow the spread of the virus and look after each other. This is a time for prudence, not panic, science, not stigma, facts, not fear. Even though the situation has been classified as a pandemic, it is one we can control. We can slow down transmissions, prevent infections, and save lives. But that will take unprecedented personal, national, and international action.
The World Health Organization says Europe is now the new coronavirus epicenter. Italy has the largest outbreak on the continent, confirming over 17,000 cases with 1,266 deaths. 250 people died on Thursday in Italy, the biggest single-day jump in deaths in the country. Spain has more than 4,000 confirmed cases, and the death toll has reached 120. The government announced a state of emergency on Friday. France and Germany are each reporting over 3,000 cases, but the death toll in France is almost 80, while Germany has reported fewer than 10 deaths. Guy Henderson reports from Geneva.
First Italy, now Spain.
Good evening, esteemed citizens. Today I have informed the head of state that tomorrow we will hold an extraordinary cabinet meeting to declare a state of emergency throughout the whole of Spain for the next 15 days. The state of emergency is a legal tool recognized in our constitution to confront a crisis as extraordinary as that which now faces the entire world and our own country.
Bulgaria too has declared an emergency after confirming just 23 cases, but it and others know the trend by now. Denmark's one of a number of countries that's seen a massive rise in cases this week. It's now advising citizens against all but essential travel. Ukraine, Czech Republic and Slovakia are amongst the European countries introducing severe restrictions on entry for foreigners, seemingly to try and prevent the same happening to them. On Friday, the World Health Organization said shutting borders won't work on its own. It's launched a fund that anyone can donate to help fight the virus.
You must take a comprehensive approach. Not testing alone, not contact tracing alone, not quarantine alone, not social distancing alone. Do it all. Any country that looks at the experience of other countries with large epidemics and thinks that won't happen to us is making a deadly mistake. It can happen to any country.
With well over 2,000 cases in Germany, large gatherings have already ceased, but Berlin's famous Philharmonie is still performing, streaming for audiences online. This continent is now the epicenter of a pandemic unseen in modern times. Governments are responding rapidly, their citizens adapting to a new norm. Guy Henderson, CGTN, Geneva.
Well, let's now take a look at how COVID-19 is spreading across Africa. There are 191 confirmed cases across 18 African countries. Ethiopia has reported its first case of COVID-19. The health ministry said the patient is a 48-year-old Japanese citizen who came to Ethiopia from Burkina Faso. Neighboring Kenya has also reported its first case. The health ministry said the patient traveled to Nairobi from the US via London. Kenyan health officials have traced the house where the victim was staying with her 7 relatives. There are now 6 confirmed deaths across the continent. Egypt still has the highest number of infections, and the health ministry has reported 13 new cases. The majority of confirmed COVID-19 cases are in North Africa, while in sub-Saharan Africa, most countries have 2 or less confirmed cases. Well, the U.S. travel ban on flights from the 26 countries in Europe has come into force as a growing number of countries across the world step up their efforts to stop the spread of the coronavirus. For more on this, I'm now joined by Tony Waterman, who's in Brussels. She'll be bringing us the details a little later on in this program. Now, the World Health Organization has urged African countries to take appropriate measures to contain the spread of the coronavirus. Now, with several African countries reporting more confirmed cases, the World Health Organization says governments must tackle COVID-19 as a priority. CGTN's Daniel Arap Moy spoke to the World Health Organization's Africa Emergency Operations Manager about the situation.
Now that the virus is spreading across several countries in Africa, is there anything specific that World Health Organization is doing to contain further spread of this virus?
What we are advising is to make sure that you have a strong entry screening process. Entry screening process is not only taking temperature, but having a system that can list people that are potentially exposed. These are people coming from countries with high transmission, that you take appropriate measures. Measures are taken based on local context. But if you have to isolate them or maybe advise self-quarantine, you have the proper mechanism to follow them up and to detect anyone that will have the first symptom.
Many countries are now moving into a lockdown situation. As World Health Organization, do you think this is the best way to fight the spread of this virus?
What WHO is advising is that it should be evidence-based. Right now, the evidence, the fact for Africa is that most of the cases are imported from countries with high local. So countries should analyze and take the appropriate measure.
And now that you've declared COVID-19 a pandemic, what exactly does this mean?
This means that, in fact, all the criteria to define the pandemic are fulfilled. It's, of course, an event that affects human and human-to-human transmission, as well as transmission across regions.
There has also been a lot of stigma, attacks against Chinese, Asians. Are there any guidelines from World Health Organization in dealing with such issues?
Our position is to avoid stigmatization. It's rather to put in place measures that can help to control and measures of solidarity.
Doctor, businesses are closing down. The world seems to be at fear. Is there any hope for a vaccine?
There is. We don't know when, but there is. While we are speaking, we have around 20 vaccines that are under experimentation. And we have also many clinical trials for treatment that are ongoing. People are testing many.
And we can now cross over to Tony Waterman in Brussels, where the U.S. travel ban on all flights from 26 countries in Europe has come into force as a growing number of countries across the world step up their efforts to stop the spread of the coronavirus. Well, let's now go to Tony Waterman. He's in Brussels for us. Tony, so it looks like things are operating per usual in Brussels for now, but in other places it is not so smooth. How will passengers get out?
Yeah, so here in Brussels, there are a number of flights in the mid-morning which head over to the United States, direct flights. All of them except one took off per usual this morning. It's unclear, though, how many passengers were actually on that flight, considering that this travel ban came into effect at 5 a.m. Belgium time. It's going to last for 30 days. As you mentioned, it applies to those 26 Schengen countries. A lot of confusion, though, over why it doesn't also extend over to the UK and Ireland. They themselves are grappling with an outbreak in the UK. Almost 800 confirmed cases at this point. As for the travelers themselves, there were long lines earlier this week when that travel ban was first announced from the United States, trying to change their tickets, see if they could get on other flights. There were stories of people spending thousands of dollars to try to buy a flight out of Europe. Americans are going to be allowed back into the United States. I spoke to one such woman who was traveling with her 2 young children, trying to get back after visiting her husband, who's on deployment in the Middle East. Take a listen to what she had to say.
We found out about the travel ban to the States, so we have a flight on Monday, but I'm nervous we're not going to get back into the States. They're going to cancel all the flights. So my 2 kids and I drove to the airport to see if we could get a flight home today, but there are no flights available. Everyone's scrambling. Everybody's trying to make sense and figure out really what's happening. So yeah, it's all up in the air. It's all a guessing game at this point.
Things at the Brussels airport were quite quiet yesterday when we were there. Obviously, this travel ban has been well broadcast by the carriers themselves. Also, the airports sent out messages to potential passengers saying as much as they could about this. There wasn't a lot of detail at first, but you're right. There are a number of places where flights are being canceled. So Norwegian Airlines, that is a budget carrier, it's going to be canceling nearly all of its long-haul flights from certain locations in Europe, places like Amsterdam and Oslo and Madrid, to the U.S. What they are trying to do is now reroute those passengers through their London Gatwick hub and then move them on to the United States. But this is really putting a lot of pressure on European carriers, which have really been on the front lines of this outbreak since the very beginning, at least the economic front lines. Many of them are struggling and are signaling that they could perhaps even go bankrupt because of this. Norwegian Airlines, because of this dramatic fall off in foot traffic, has had to lay off 50% of its staff. And of course, we saw Flybe, that is the British airline, go under already just last week.
All right, Tony Waterman joining us there from Brussels with that update. Thank you. And in Ghana, shopping malls are putting in place safety measures to contain the spread of the coronavirus. This comes after the country recorded 2 cases of the disease. CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai reports from Accra.
Safety first. Shopping malls in Accra are trying to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Ghana has recorded 2 cases of COVID-19, raising fears among the public.
I'm making sure I'm using more of my sanitizer, washing my hands. You can't be too careful, but then we hope that everything will get better soon. Yeah, we are hoping for a vaccine.
I'll do the maximum I can to avoid close contact. Wash my hand, my face more frequently. Advise my family to do same, my loved ones to do same.
One of the 2 confirmed cases of the coronavirus is a Norwegian diplomat, while the other is a Ghanaian who came into the country from Turkey. Health officials say the 2 have been quarantined and are receiving treatment. The Norwegian embassy in Ghana has shut down temporarily, while officials are tracing the people the diplomat came into contact with. The government says it's stepping up its public health awareness campaign on the coronavirus in schools and public places. It is also urging people not to travel to high-risk countries. The government has committed $100 million to curtail the spread of COVID-19. The funds will be used to buy kits and protective gear for frontline workers and provide resources to all regional hospitals designated to handle suspected cases. Beyond this, health officials say there must be a cultural shift away from the common practice of shaking hands to greet people.
We have to get to a point where people feel comfortable having tissue on them, feel comfortable using a hand sanitizer, and do not take offense when somebody doesn't shake their hands or says, let's do a fist bump or an elbow bump. We don't get offended.
Ghana's economy is already suffering from the impacts of the pandemic. China is the country's largest trade partner. An outbreak of the coronavirus in Ghana could further worsen the situation. While people are keeping to good personal hygiene, they want the government to strengthen surveillance and screening at all entry points in order not to record more cases of COVID-19. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
Let's now head to Nigeria, where schools are joining the global fight to defeat the coronavirus. Schools have been identified as high-risk areas for contracting the virus. As CGTN's Kelechi Emekalam reports, learning institutions are now inculcating hygiene and safety standards in their studies.
Being a student, parent or teacher wouldn't give one free pass into this school compound. What will is the running water, soap and hand sanitizers for washing and sanitizing the hands. This is part of recent measures introduced by the school to reduce the risk of infections, especially COVID-19. Nigeria has 2 confirmed cases, raising concerns on possible spread of the virus. The fear is even higher in schools, where children are more susceptible to infections. So the school authorities insist on maintaining hygiene standards.
We take their temperature every morning to make sure that it's within range for a healthy child. And that apart from that, we also have our sick bay where we keep children, because children can come in healthy in the morning, not running temperature. Within 2 hours of coming in, you find out that temperature is above normal. We have our transportation that can always move the child in case of any emergency. And apart from that, we have the NCDC hotline. That means if you notice anything that is outside what it should be, or we suspect something that we are not comfortable with, we reach out to them immediately.
Aside from the safety measures, the schools have introduced basic hygiene trainings to their classes, teaching children at various levels how to keep themselves safe and measures to take in case of an infection.
Coronavirus are viruses that causes respiratory illness such as cough, cold, fever, sneeze, and pneumonia, and it can lead to death.
The best way for me to prevent coronavirus is covering my mouth when I sneeze, washing my hands regularly, sanitizing my hands, and keeping my environment clean.
With these efforts of schools, health officials say they would help prevent the introduction and spread of COVID-19. Government has been strengthening monitoring and response capacity through upgraded laboratories in line with global best practices. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
Across Africa, people are concerned and they are taking precautions to make sure they do not get infected with COVID-19. From hanging behaviors to watching what they eat and where they go. Let's see what precautions some South Africans are taking.
I think what I'm doing more vociferously is watching what I eat, watching how I sleep, watching how I move, and then also not going anywhere where there are too many people. So it's I'm watching holistically my health and the health of my family.
And I'm also just more aware of where I go to. I don't aimlessly wander in shopping malls anymore. I keep my distance from people, and if I don't have to go somewhere, I'm not going.
You're watching Africa Live. Still ahead on the program, we take a look at some of the women identified by Time magazine as the most influential in shaping the past century.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
And we continue our coverage of COVID-19. Now, Greece's Olympic Committee said it has cancelled the remaining part of the Olympic torch relay through the country on Friday to avoid attracting crowds that could raise the risk of coronavirus infections. The Tokyo 2020 Olympics torch relay got underway on Thursday when the flame was lit by the rays of the sun in ancient Olympia in a ceremony that was scaled down in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. The flame's journey in Greece had been due to last 7 days. On Friday, it arrived in the Peloponnese town of Sparta, where Hollywood actors Billy Zane and Gerard Butler also ran as a torchbearer. The Hellenic Olympic Committee said the opening leg of the relay had attracted unexpectedly high crowds, forcing it to suspend the remaining stops after consultations with the Greek Health Ministry and the International Olympic Committee.
I hope it carries on. There was a time when, in the ancient days, all wars would stop for the Olympics. It was very civilized agreement among nations that no matter what was happening, a war would stop and the Olympics would carry on, and the battle would carry on via representation of the nation's best athletes. And it feels like we're at war collectively, and the common enemy is Corona. And it felt like perhaps for maybe even just this morning, the war stopped, and some healing could occur.
Well, let's get more on the impact of COVID-19 on sports. And I'm joined by sports journalist Sadiq Shaban. He's in Iten in Kenya. And Adel Mahrouri is joining us from Cairo in Egypt. Sadiq, first to you, though. The athletics season has been deeply affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So far, the major marathons have been postponed to later on in the year. How are the athletes coping so far without what is one of the major sources of income?
Beatrice, Kenyan athletes here in Iten and the larger Rift Valley area, which is considered the home, the spiritual source of world athletics talents, are now counting losses running into thousands of dollars in terms of missed revenues and opportunities that have now been lost as a result of cancellation of big marathons around the world. Olympic champion and defending London Marathon champion Eliud Kipchoge has been speaking about the cancellation, rather the postponement of London Marathon, which was due in April, now has been pushed forward to October. We also had Boston Marathon coming up in April, now shelved until September. Paris Marathon suffering the same fate. Barcelona Marathon also going the same way. We've also had the World Indoor Championship, also the World Half Marathon Championships. All of these events have now been shelved to a later date. So it's hitting particularly the Kenyan athletes who are depending on this championship for revenue the hard way, because the National Federation said it's not going to clear any athlete to travel, and national competitions also in Kenya have now been limited. So the athletes are actually training at the moment, unsure about when and where they're going to train after their training.
Right. Adele, FIFA and CAF have postponed all their major upcoming qualifiers. What does this do to the 2021 AFCON and the 2022 FIFA World Cup calendars?
Well, basically, there's more concern about the African Cup of Nations rather than the World Cup qualifiers. The World Cup still has sometimes for national teams and national federations to make up for the schedule if it comes to an effect or several weeks of delays as planned in general. But the more concern comes for the Africa Cup of Nations, or the AFCON, and this is where the national teams have already have been drawn into groups. They have already begun the preparation itself, and we're talking about less than a year for this entire qualification process to come to an end. And therefore, CAF is more concerned about that, but still how it will go on with it or when it will resume, it's still also not clear. We know that in general there is concerns about travel. There are some countries who have banned other African countries from coming into their home, and therefore that will definitely affect the qualification process itself. And while FIFA in general has taken the decision to postpone the qualification for the Africa Cup of Nations for the men and for the women, as well as the World Cup qualification, the Under-17 World Cup qualification as well, it's still not clear about exactly how will CAF proceed. There is a test, however, that will come later on in terms of organizational plans, the African champions, the CHAN.
Right.
It will be held in April, and it seems that CAF will still be trying to get a more picture about how the virus is affecting the football scene.
Well, Adele, it does seem that there is quite a lot of disruption in the football field there. But with the majority of the leagues now suspended across the globe, what is the next step for the players? Do they train in their homes, in the foreign leagues, or do they travel back home and train in their home nationalities?
Well, for Egypt, there isn't any impact on the players domestically who are inside the country. The domestic leagues is continuing behind closed doors, which has been quite a disappointed as fans were looking forward to come back to the stadiums, which has been gradually happening. But the trainings domestically, not just for football, but for the entire other range of sports is continuing. Domestic competitions in other sports besides football have been suspended. The swimming championships, the domestic one, the Egyptian Cup, has been postponed. Pentathlon, judo, taekwondo, you name it. Almost every single sport has frozen its domestic activity in terms of competitions, but the national teams are continuing with their trainings. Just had a call with the deputy head of the Egyptian Olympics Committee, and he has confirmed that the general scene is not cancellation, but postponement. And so far, all domestic competitions have been postponed for 2 weeks, with exception, of course, to football. And the Olympics Committee has a meeting with the International Olympics Committee on Wednesday through conference call, through which they will be planning the qualifications for the next round of Tokyo.
Right. Sadiq, let us come to that Olympics committee meeting that Adele is talking about. And the International Olympics Committee has come out strongly saying the games are still on course. Is there a risk of this year's Summer Games being postponed?
Beatrice, the IOC insists that the Olympic Games are still on schedule, but for athletes to get to Japan for the Olympics proper, they have to qualify. They have to travel from one region to another for continental competitions and to events which serve as Olympic qualifiers. And all of these are not happening at the moment. The African Weightlifting Championship due in Mauritius next month has been cancelled. A major Grand Prix event due in Morocco again next week has also been iced. So at this point, athletes who have not qualified for Olympics are wondering where, or rather when they are going to do that. Weightlifting, swimming, badminton, these are some of the federations that have found themselves really, in an upside-down situation, unsure what to do at this point. But the athletes say they will have to keep training and hope that the situation improves, or in order to be assured at least of making an opportunity to go to Tokyo. But some federations are insisting that they are not going to cancel the event. They're actually just going to postpone it. So the IOC has left some of these decisions to some federations to make up their minds about. But on the ground, things are a little bit different. As they say, the athletes are not so sure when, in fact, they are going to qualify, if at all, they will qualify for the Olympic Games.
All right, Sadiq Shaban joining us there from Iten in Western Kenya, and Adel Mahrui joining us from Cairo. To you both, thank you. Now, since the beginning of time, women have always had a huge hand in shaping the world. But as we know, those achievements are not always recognized. Well, Time magazine has released a series of special covers celebrating and honoring 100 women who helped define the last 100 years. 6 Chinese women and 3 Africans are featured. Here's CGTN's Jen Keo with more on that story.
There's still a long way to go, but for the first time in human history, we are as close as we've ever been to gender equality. From politics to science, business to entertainment, women are on the rise. Getting here has not been easy, and all too often, the history books remember the deeds of men. Time magazine is playing its part in changing that, celebrating 100 women who have shaped our shared history over the last century. Described as a pioneer revolutionary of modern China, Xiang Jingyu was an advocate for the education of girls and women. In 1922, she became the first director of the Chinese Communist Women's Bureau and the first ever female member of the CCP Central Committee. Anna May Wong is considered to be the first Chinese-American movie star in Hollywood. The fashion icon's career includes 50 films, but Hollywood stereotyping saw her leave for Europe, where she said she found more receptive audiences. Once described as the Empress of China, Song Mei-ling was married to the Kuomintang party chief Chiang Kai-shek, then leader of China from 1927 to 1949. She was the first Chinese national to address both U.S. houses of Congress and stayed in the White House, pushing for American support to help China during the Japanese War of Aggression from 1937 to 1944. The role of women in the development of nuclear weapons, known as the Manhattan Project, has often been understated. But without Chinese-American physicist Qian Xingwu, the project would not have been a success. Her research earned her nicknames like the First Lady of Physics and the Queen of Nuclear Research. Once dubbed the most beautiful woman in the world, China Machado died 4 years ago at the age of 86. She was of Chinese-Portuguese descent. The model became the first person of color to appear on the cover of American fashion magazine Harper's Bazaar. Artemisinin is credited with preventing millions of malaria deaths. In 1972, Tu Youyou, a Chinese scientist and malariologist, discovered the drug found in sweet wormwood, a plant used in traditional Chinese remedies. Tu not only found a way to extract artemisinin, but tested the new drug on herself to speed up development. The discovery earned her the 2015 Nobel Prize in Medicine, the first by a Chinese scientist. Nicknamed Mama Africa, South African singer, songwriter, actress Miriam Makeba was seen as the symbol of the anti-apartheid campaign. But while her outspokenness and songs in many languages and genres increased her popularity across the globe, back at home, it rubbed authorities in the wrong way. For 31 years, she was exiled in the UK and US, but continued her activism. She testified against the apartheid regime at the UN in 1963. Makeba went on to gain international acclaim, including winning a Grammy. From being the first woman in Central and East Africa to earn a PhD, to being the first African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, Wangari Maathai was a trailblazer, but she also never shied away from breaking the glass ceiling. She founded the Greenbelt movement to teach rural women to make a living. The movement also reforested urban areas. But she often clashed with authorities, which landed her in jail. By the time of her death, her movement had planted an estimated 50 million trees. In 2005, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf made history as Africa's first elected female president. With limited resources after a 14-year civil war that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands, Sirleaf rebuilt key infrastructure, ushered economic revival, maintained peace that saw her win a Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. Despite the lack of resources, she also oversaw the Ebola crisis in 2014. But as she left office in 2018 after 12 years, allegations of corruption and nepotism would taint her legacy. Well, 100 years on, the role of women cannot be understated, even though gender inequality remains one of the major social issues of our times. Women are still struggling to make it in what many of them see as largely a man's world. Jane Keo, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, earlier on, I spoke to Wanjira Maathai, the Vice President and Regional Director for Africa at WRI World Resources Institute. She's also the current chair of the Wangari Maathai Foundation. Her mother, Professor Wangari Maathai, is among the women honored in the Time magazine special edition. I began by asking her about the strides women have made in the last 100 years.
We've come a long way. I mean, I think I'm myself an example as the Vice President and Regional Director for Africa for one of the largest organizations in environment and development in the world, is a really good recognition that women in leadership is no longer just words. There are a lot of women, especially African women, who are finding themselves in places of leadership.
So you talk about often the recognized people are normally male, right? Yeah. So what are some of the hurdles that stand in the way of women getting their recognition?
Well, I think historically women have just been excluded. We are not at the table when decisions are being made on boards or in the top leadership. We often have responsibility without authority, is what I say. And so this is what has to change. But I think also because of the historical exclusion of women, there's also been somewhat of an acquiescence. Women often don't put themselves forward for leadership. I've seen that most recently in our politics, where you have clear provisions, legal provisions for women to be in leadership. And it's difficult sometimes to find women to run for office. I've seen it in community leadership at the Greenbelt movement, where women were often always the only group members. And so the leadership of the governance of those groups was often women. So women were the chair, they were the secretary, they were the treasurer. But as soon as one man entered the group and they became, you know, a more integrated group, when they picked the leader, they would often always pick the man.
So you raise a very interesting aspect of even though women put themselves forward, we don't tend to, women don't tend to pick a fellow woman when seeking leadership. Now, if you look at a country like Kenya, where you have the majority of voters are women, and yet Kenya has never voted a woman president, despite the fact that there have been a woman who's put herself forward for presidential, positions. It is often said that women are their worst enemies. Yeah. Are they?
Well, I don't know, but this I know for sure. Let us not romanticize. It's not that all women are good leaders, and certainly not that all men are not good leaders. I think we have to ensure that the quality of leadership we get is of the highest standard, whether it's male or female. So what women are looking for is not just to be given leadership. We must earn that leadership.
My conversation earlier with Wanjira Maathai, the Vice President and Regional Director for Africa at WRI World Resources Institute. You're watching Africa Live, still ahead on the program. We meet South African artist Gerard van Vuuren, known for his large-scale contemporary portraits.
Join us in global business and see Africa through our eyes.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Canada, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
A report detailing mass corruption in South Africa's water sector has been released. Money Down the Drain is an in-depth investigation carried out by Corruption Watch and the international body Water Integrity Network. Losses from irregular contracts, failing equipment and supply disruptions runs into millions of dollars. CGTN's Angelo Coppola reports.
Widespread corruption in South Africa's water sector ballooned from $3 million to $25 million between 2015 and 2019. A report entitled Money Down the Drain by Corruption Watch and Water Integrity Network revealed that this has compromised water quality and is putting people's lives at risk.
If you don't have safe drinking water, people actually die. So it affects people enormously. One of the other things is that obviously where you don't have proper water supply being delivered, generally quite often women and girl children are the ones who have to collect water. And so their lives are impacted on particularly around having to go and wait in line to collect water from a tanker or whatever it is.
It really does filter down from the biggest dam to the smallest tanker operator. And, you know, it speaks to endemic, systemic corruption in this area, which is why, you know, our major recommendation is for this to be declared a kind of an island of integrity, a sort of no-go zone for corruption, because we are dealing not just with particular instances of corruption in this contract or that township, but you're talking about an entire system that has been deeply, deeply corrupted.
Around 3 million South Africans still can't access this precious commodity. Half the country's waste and water treatment plants are in disarray, and new projects have been delayed by tender fraud. The report did, however, note that corruption is a global challenge.
Throughout the world, the construction sector is actually vulnerable to corruption. It's big money. In the water sector, the projects are often very different, so it's not easy to compare one to the other. If you're building a dam, you can't compare easily the costs of one dam versus another dam because the conditions are so different. So it's quite difficult to put in the checks and balances. So the infrastructure sector globally is vulnerable to corruption.
There have been calls for an independent water regulator, but authors of the report place ethical leadership at the heart of fixing the problem.
This is a sector in which you want to give very, very special attention to who is appointed as minister, to who the officials are who run the department, to tightening up procurement regimes, to recognizing what are red flags for corruption. And there is considerable literature and experience on this, particularly in the construction and civil engineering space.
The widespread corruption now puts government under pressure to meet its target to provide universal access to water in the next decade. The country has to spend around $7 billion a year to fix up water systems and meet its sustainable development goals. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
A former refugee from Mali has returned home to start his own tailoring business. Packed with valuable skills he learned in Burkina Faso, Sidi Ouid Amin has ventured to offering support to other refugees through vocational training with the aim of becoming self-reliant. CGTN's Brian Toussaint has that story.
In 2012, hundreds of thousands of people from Mali fled to Burkina Faso after conflict erupted. Armed rebels and government forces were at loggerheads over independence and greater autonomy for the northern region. Sidi Ouid Amin is among those who chose to seek refuge in a bid to ensure safety for his family.
We became poor people. Before we were fine, but after this tragedy, the destruction, stealing, strikes, we have nothing left.
While living at the refugee camp, Sidi engaged in a training program ran by the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. He was adamant on turning his fate around through tailoring, in the hopes of becoming self-reliant.
When I was informed that there was a tailoring program, I decided that's what I would prefer to do because my children's clothes at home are torn.
After returning home back in 2017, Sidi set up a tailoring business in Mopti. He can now provide for his family and train youth from disadvantaged communities, helping them acquire tailoring skills.
This has become a small school as well. It prevents youth from straying or begging. They can benefit from the little experience I have.
By February 2020, over 130,000 refugees had fled Mali. Those displaced sought refuge in Niger, Mauritania, and Burkina Faso, which are also grappling with insecurity and staggering levels of displacement. Despite the enduring threat, some 70,000 Malians have chosen to return over time to areas they felt were safe enough to go back to. Brian Toussaint, CGTN.
Now, there are many artists who've made a name by using their surroundings to create art. One of them is Gerard van Vuren. The Pretoria-based artist's style is distinctive. The way he documents his subjects makes his work unique. CGTN's Elisa Njamela takes a look at the artist and his work.
Gerard van Vuren's paintings are quite striking. He's well known for his large-scale contemporary portraits depicting all cultures. But his main portraits depict bold, beautiful black African women.
I prefer painting African women. I do paint men and European-looking people too, but mostly African women because they've got voluptuous lips, full-figured. I like to express myself through bold colors, and I mean, African people are normally, you know, bright beads and so forth.
Gerard uses everyday experiences as a starting point. His paintings are a direct response to his immediate environment.
I live in Africa, and that's what I paint, what I see every day, and also a little bit what I feel. I try to portray emotion in my work, and I name my work also normally after emotion, and that's also what sort of resonates with people. Like this painting here, it's called Innocent. Innocence. She's a young girl, she's innocent looking. You can't quite place what she's feeling.
For someone who uses a splash of colors, Gerard can't quite distinguish between some colors.
Something that not many people know about me, I'm colorblind. So it's easy for me because I don't have preconceived ideas about what goes with what and what doesn't. So for me, it's just an expression. I don't care about what color values and whatever doesn't or do work. And it's what better way to express it than bold and neon, and I enjoy it.
His choice of medium is acrylic paint.
I prefer to work with acrylics. And the only reason being is because I like to work fast. I don't want to think too much about what I do. There's a lot of thought process beforehand, but while I execute the work, I don't want to think about it too much because it shows. I like to just be expressive, bold, and with acrylics, because it dries so quickly, you have to be quick. You can't rework and so forth. So I put color and that's it.
So I quickly tried my hand at this.
You see.
So I can use this
now
on the
you
other
go
side
the
as
other
well?
way.
I can just play.
Yes, you see.
Look at your eyes of the artist. This artist tells me that his work is about layers.
You'll notice my work is mostly, if you take away the facial features, it's mostly abstract. There's a lot of stuff going on, and it's just an abstract piece because who has yellow on their forehead and a smudge of pink on their cheek, or, you know, it's about layers.
Gerard's artworks are well received by South Africans as well as international collectors and investors. Yulison Jawela for CGTN in Pretoria, South Africa.
And your sports news coming up next. Here's what's ahead. CAF postpones the March 2021 Africa Cup of Nations qualifiers due to the corona